Hello, Jen, and nice to have you
Pedro,
here.
nice to be here.
So, we have this next hour to chat about you so that we can learn about all the things that you've been learning, that you've been thinking about. And yeah, so welcome. And perhaps I can say a few words about you. I mean, we know each other for a very long time, and most over the last years you've been studying and getting more into the study in general about like ecology, geopolitics, and also food systems, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's more or less where I think we could cover the ground, because I know that you've been thinking a lot about how those things like come together, and you also been dedicating a lot of time to read. And I guess we can use the time just just to exchange, and maybe you can share with us like what are your thoughts and what are the things that you're realizing in this process of research. And this conversation should not just be a final conversation, so I know that you'll be learning more and updating your thinking, and we can pick it up another point again and continue. So
Okay. Good.
what is this? I mean, what is the ecology? What is geopolitics in this context, and what does this have to do with food systems?
Okay. So I'm studying um, environment, politics, and society. So um, my kind of angle on it and my interest is in the food supply chain as the kind of major opportunity to reconsider how we organize ourselves um, in society and address some of the big problems that we're facing right now. Um, and I think food is really interesting because it's this fundamental power of of being able to live. Um, I think learning about geopolitics and looking at it from a wide angle lens, you can start to understand the mechanics of, first of all, the global neoliberal market system. And I think I'm really interested in it because I grew up on a farm, and um, in this time there was a really big switch over to industrial agricultural methods in Canada. So my father had a rather small farm. I guess it wasn't a normal farm size when he was a child. He took over his parents' farm, and when I was a teenager, these big changes in the technical methods and the technology, the machinery, meant that farms were scaling up in a big way, and my father was not going to be profitable anymore with his size of farm. So this was a crisis for my family in a way, and I remember wondering how it could make any sense that if my father had, at that point he had 200 pigs, and I think and thinking about how many people that could keep alive for how long, uh, I couldn't really make sense of it, why there couldn't be any money to be made out of this, because it seemed to me like that this amount of nutrition must equal a certain amount of income. So I guess that's the thing that's in the background of my mind when I'm uh, looking into these things, and wondering how they've changed in the last few decades, especially, and how they could change in the future in response to the problems of climate change, especially.
And
Yeah.
what did you see, like, if you look at the whole world and based on what you've been looking at, what has changed. I mean, because you talk about this particular change within Canada that affected your family, but like, what do you think? What are the macro changes that happened, and are there any particular countries that suffered more? What, how was this process over the last decades? And
I think like the last decades, it's really been a process of land consolidation. So in order to become more efficient, farmers have had to buy more, like larger amounts of land, and have better technology. And the suffering comes from people being taken off of taken off of their land. I'm not sure that in Canada it has become really hard for any small farmer to make it financially. So they've had to find other ways of making money. Um, and then these industrial farms can be run now by very few people. So it's become a kind of exodus or an expulsion of people from the land, and people are moving to cities. And I think that's where you get the hardship and the precarity is when people go from having a little bit of, even a little bit of land where they could be somewhat self-sufficient, to going to the city where they have no land, no housing, and they're trying to find an opportunity because that's where there's more money flowing around. Um, yeah.
so, and do you have like, I mean, I remember being like some years ago looking at the numbers of like how the land prices have increased, especially in Western Europe and also in Germany. Do you have like any statistics showing like how this process happened and like and who has been buying this land? I mean, has it been like just the farmer that was more efficient, or has that also been like corporations? Because I know there are some corporations that are very involved in this sort of like food production. So how do you have any insights there?
Um, yeah, I don't have any statistics off the top of my head, but I do know that most farmers now are actually large business owners. It's a corporate enterprise farming, and um, the other trend that we're seeing now is that land is being bought up in different countries by other countries trying to improve their own food security. So they're trying to ensure that they have people to feed. They have food to feed their own people. They have land to supply that food. Um, so this is a trend, and it's a bit worrying because it displaces people in within their own countries, and um, these parcels of land are then used to create food for export only, rather than creating any kind of local food sources. So it's damaging because it weakens the opportunities for people to be self-sufficient within their own country, because the other country wants to be more secure. And often the regulations in countries that are less wealthy are weaker, and the governments are weaker, and it's really difficult to prevent someone from selling land and making a lot of money that they wouldn't have otherwise. Um, yeah, I think that's the land
Yeah.
ownership debate that's going around right now.
Yeah, I mean, I was just trying to pull some data here in the background,
Mm.
but basically, yeah, that basically illustrates that. But basically, there is, and I don't know, I would just be, I think like that, yeah, all the statistics show that, that, the farmland prices have skyrocketed, if you can see here, right?
Yeah.
So this is like this is here back in the 90s, and it's like
Hmm.
this is just until 2001, but we can see 2011. So you can see at least 3x
Yeah.
here.
I think the other interesting
Where it is.
timing period is from the crash in 2008. And I think
Yeah.
after that, banks and financial entities became much more interested in owning land
Yeah.
as a kind of commodity.
Yeah, it's like the incentive systems from the industrialization of land or whatever, from this like new type of agriculture. They created an incentive system for more uh, predictable agricultural processes that are run in more large scale, and therefore this becomes a more interesting asset, right? Because you can really control like any other, like a factory, right? You
Hmm.
can control outcome and you can run it with fewer people. So
Yeah.
mm, that's interesting. And then like I guess like I mean I've been looking a bit into this whole like the food industry, and there's a few companies, conglomerates that pretty much own everything there, right?
Yeah.
It's like
The, the short form is ABCD. Those are the big transnational food corporations. Um,
yeah.
I need to review the actual names, but it's
Yeah, it's like I think it's like you have
Archer.
like Coca-Cola, Kraft, Nestle, P&G, PepsiCo, and then Kellogg's, Mars, Johnson and Johnson, and Unilever, I think.
Yeah, I guess I've been focusing more on grains. So I've been looking at the ABCD transnational corporations, and those are
Yes.
ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus, and they control 75 to 90% of the global trade in grains. So that's rice, that's wheat, that's a major part of the food that we eat. So chances are,
Yeah.
if you've eaten bread today, or if you've had some vitamins, or if you've used certain cosmetic creams, chances are that you've actually been using their products every day without even knowing it, because they're
And
very
that's
private. They're very private.
exactly.
Two of them are privately owned family corporations. So
Yeah.
they're also opaque. You can't, they're not transparent.
Yeah, that's what I
Um,
find fascinating about like some really huge organizations, corporations, when they make all they can to stay really, really opaque and
yeah.
un unknown, so nobody really can even criticize them and talk about them. I mean, the information is out there, but like they're not a B2C brand that people will be able to blame for anything, and these monopolies can stay over centuries, and like
Hmm.
nobody pays attention to it. So
Yeah, I think that kind of invisibility is really interesting, because they're obviously extremely powerful and manipulating things behind the scenes in ways that we don't know. And combined with the power of the global agrochemical giants, uh, it becomes really, really difficult to think about transforming the system, because all of them are incentivized to keep it the way it is.
yeah. So when you talk about the agrochemical, yeah, because we were talking about the food production, it's like what is the role of the agrochemical industry and what is happening there? What are the players? I mean, everybody kind of knows that there was Monsanto, that now it's Bayer, which was responsible for a lots of like these uh, gene seeds and did a lot of and did also like I guess they had uh this thing to increase the milk from the cows. I forgot the name of the product. But like what are the other corporations that are out there and what's happening and what's their relationship to this type of farming? And
Well, I'm not really well versed in the different corporations that are controlling the agrochemical trade. Of course, Monsanto is the obvious player, but there's definitely more out there. Um, yeah, I would have to look into that to name any names.
Yeah,
But
but this is there any relationship to like codependence relationship to this like more industrial farming methods
definitely, I
and
mean,
how does it happen?
go ahead.
How does that happen? Like that is there if there is a codependency, how does this codependency happen? And ultimately, what is the outcome of this? Is this better soil, worse soil, degradation? What is the overall like result over the cycles of production?
So, in my understanding, the application of agrochemicals have been okay. We have several different things going on. We have, first of all, the pesticides and herbicides, and then we have custom designed seeds. So the seeds are particularly designed for certain chemicals to be planted together with them.
Hmm.
So and these seeds are um, they're they're a product. They're not a true seed because they don't reproduce in a way that you can use the seed straight again from the plant. So the thing that I've been thinking about is the fundamental way that this changes the role of the farmer. Um, and you asked what do the chemicals do over the long term? The chemicals create a reliance. It's a bit like I don't know if you've seen the recent research on antidepressants, but there's
Yeah.
more and more evidence that if you start taking antidepressants, your body becomes very reliant on them, and it's extremely difficult to come off of them because the whole balance of the body becomes adjusted to that. And I think we see a similar thing with chemicals in the soil. So, in order for the soil to be very productive, once you start using these chemicals to produce, you need the whole mix of things to be able to keep producing in the soil because the soil loses the other qualities that it had that made it really complex and resilient. And one of the problems that we have now is that there's no standardization to measure the health of soil. There are some metrics that people use, but there's no agreed upon soil health monitor. So I think that's also a product of certain priorities that this is not on the agenda. That these companies, of course, are quite happy with the status quo and would rather not think about the long term effects of all of this. Um, so I think in this process, the farmer has become a consumer. Um, and this is a pretty big change because before the farmers were, if they owned land, then that was what they needed. They could get seeds from their neighbors and then be able to reproduce their own seeds. And of course, there was a lot more work without herbicides and pesticides. So they would need more labor, but they were their own masters. And now they serve uh, a much larger entity and purpose to produce these food commodities and not necessarily to produce food. So um, I think that's also reflected in the way that the soil has changed. So because farmers are using these chemicals, they've changed the makeup of the soil, and in order for them to step away from that, if they choose to become organic um, or use agroecological methods, they need to then stop using these and they're crippled because there's a period of time in which the soil would need to recover. It takes, I think it's a 5 year, um, I think it's a 5 year span in Canada for land to be declared organic after
It's like
chemical use.
rehab time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and do
So
you know
that,
any?
yeah.
Do you know like any sort of numbers into like is the soil using this sort of petrochemical processes? Is the soil becoming more acidic, more neutral, more? Are there any like clear measured indications of what happens in the soil? Yeah, after those processes, does the soil contain those chemicals then? Does it go into the water systems underneath? Like what happens to all of these chemicals going in? Like,
I mean, a lot of it washes into the water system. Yes, for
so which
sure.
means then it comes back to us.
Yeah, it always comes back to us. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Uh, even something like antibiotics, uh,
Yeah.
it's something you don't, or at least I didn't really think about this, but antibiotics are entering the soil all the time
Yeah.
because manure is used as a fertilizer, um, and antibiotics are used in order to promote growth in a lot of animals, in cows especially, and pigs. They are
Yeah.
also used medicinally to address disease or prevent disease, but they're actually they're given to promote growth so that the animals grow faster when they have antibiotics because they process the food more quickly and
Hmm.
efficiently. And then this manure goes onto the soil. Depending on the country you're in, Europe has pretty strong regulations around this now. So antibiotics aren't used nearly as much here anymore.
Yeah.
So the antibiotics go directly into the soil, and then in the soil they affect the bacterial community that's there. So the bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics stick around and thrive, and the other bacteria are um, are changed. And I also learned about something called horizontal gene transfer. So some resistant bacteria can actually change other bacteria around them just through exchanging genes. And
So that means it's like a resistant bacteria that has been resistant to the antibiotics. It's almost like
it can
it's
make other
almost like
bacteria resistant as well. Yeah.
yeah, it's almost like the bacterias are a part of a bigger body, and then they have had a disease, and which is disease is like the antibiotics from their perspective, right? And they just become immune. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, we
Yeah.
don't want to die. We
Yeah.
we wanna better learn.
Yeah.
Like we don't want to die, and then they become all kind of like resistant to that. Yeah,
So it's an evolved community of resistance. And then this
yeah,
can transfer onto food, onto fruits and vegetables. And
yeah,
it's difficult still to create direct links between the health effects of this and the actual practice.
yeah.
But it's
Especially
definitely
because
there.
especially when it covers everything, right? It affects
Yeah.
everybody, so it's really hard. Like, how are you going to compare?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the water systems are everywhere, and they will affect everything, even the organic farmers somehow indirectly.
Yeah.
So, so
Yeah.
yeah, that makes it really hard.
Yeah, I think
Interesting.
like again with soil, it's this process of simplification of trying to unify something and make it very simple so that it can be easily managed. But in the end, taking the diversity away of the bacterial communities makes it
And also
more
taking,
weak.
most important, taking the ability of something to be self-sustaining away, right? Taking it,
Mhm.
it's like if there was some societal collapse, it would be really hard for us to produce food because we would have like all this land that is not ready to be used in a normal way, and we
Well,
have all the seed. that it has to be produced in some lab that is very specific, right?
Yeah, I think that's already happening because in recently, I think it was 2018 or 2019 in Sri Lanka, they couldn't afford to buy fertilizer.
Yes.
So they decided to go to organic agriculture, and it was a disaster because it was
Yeah.
also combined with weather events that they couldn't control, and
Yeah.
they couldn't produce the things that they wanted to.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah. It led
there
to
you
a
see
total
the
society
weakness
collapse, right?
of yeah,
Economical
there's
collapse, I
so many
guess.
people that are going hungry there now that are
Yeah.
malnourished, that cannot afford the basic things,
Yeah.
and it's really awful because it should be a step change for the better, right? That they were able to move to a sustainable system, that they weren't damaging their ecosystems anymore in the way that they had previously. And
Yeah. That's.
it came from this. There's a huge issue with kidney disease in Sri Lanka, and people were relating this to the practice of using agrochemicals. That's not been clearly established, but it does seem to be that it's because of contaminated water. So I'm sure it's somewhat related.
Hmm.
Um, so you see, like, these people trying to change the system because they see themselves being poisoned, and
Hmm.
it's very sad that now it's been a disaster. And the documents that I've read in um, yeah, policy documents with recommendations to address this now, all of it is going back into the market based commodity flow, and re-energizing and confirming that structure. So
So then, I mean, but one of the points that made me think since we started here this conversation is that I guess if we want to have a larger transformation, you have to create this, you have to put funding into this rehab time, right? Like
yeah,
you have to like,
and education. I think that
exactly.
they got
They
the
have 5 years
farmers.
to
The only
educate.
thing the farmers got was a little bit of education around making organic compost. But
Yeah.
everybody needs to be re-educated. Anybody who eats food needs to reflect on this process of what they're eating and
Yeah.
how it's coming to them. And the farmer needs to learn the methods again, because so
Well,
many of these methods, and also the variety of the foods that we used to eat, have been lost through the
so
displacement of them.
I guess like it's very interesting because I think like from the government from a policy perspective, it's almost like, when we buy cigarettes, there is a lot of taxes on top of cigarettes because the government says like this is gonna cost me a lot of money to get people off this thing, and they're gonna get cancer and they're gonna get these things. So you need to charge taxes on this, and then some governments they will also create some sort of like uh, ways to support the population to get off this, right? So I guess if there was the understanding that this industry kind of works like in this addictive way, um, it would be interesting to look at like, okay, if a farmer wants to get off this, how do they do who do they
Hmm.
come to, and how do they get support to start another system, and then where does this funding come from for the farmer to be able to transform, like 'cause I guess there are lots of farmers out there that probably realize this, but they are locked in the system and they're like, whatever, I just need to pay the bills for the next month and I can't,
Exactly. Yeah.
because I know it's
And
really
I think
hard business to be a farmer.
I think it's really, really sad because they're the ones with this direct link to the soil, and they're the ones that actually have this material experience of changing the ecosystem around them. And most of us, this is very abstract because we buy food at a store and we don't even think about it, but this is his daily work, or hers. Um, And I think now, with the knowledge we have and the changes we're seeing, that the psychological weight of this is also really serious and something to be aware of.
Okay, so we covered, now we covered this sort of like um food systems. What is the state of the food systems? What what has happened like at least since like the 80s, 90s, and what is like this new tendency of like after this, I think they call it green revolution, right?
There was the
I
Green
don't,
Revolution, yeah,
yeah.
in the 70s.
Yes,
Yeah,
that they that was the initialization of this sort of industrial processes to agriculture to increase productivity, right?
yeah. And
Yeah,
that was a really important moment and kind of a beautiful one because in a lot of ways we did fix global hunger. Uh, we're growing more than enough food for all the people in the world. Um, but that's the sad thing about it too, because it wasn't actually about producing more food, turns out.
yeah,
um, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, we still, yeah, it's a matter of distribution, and I think also it's a matter of like, I mean, from my
It's not just a
perspective,
matter of, I think it's more than a matter of distribution. Uh,
uh,
yeah, I think it's a big systemic problem.
yeah. Yeah, it's also, I mean, I think the core for me, like abstracting from my viewpoint here, is that I think any system that doesn't allow you to be sovereign in the system, that and then create some sort of dependency relationship on some commercial structure, and then creates and then degrades the the means of production, which is the soil somehow. So
Hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense, like just from a purely trying to look uh, abstracting all the issues that of course we want to feed the people and there's a, but I feel like those kind of systems they seem to be kind of like some sort of pact with some non life supporting forces, but like just just in a very abstract sense. Obviously, I think
I think,
pragmatically speaking, it makes sense in many ways as well. Like that, I can understand how it got there, but I feel like somehow it obvious to me that we need to get out of this kind of systems and figure out ways how we can scale different types of food production in a way that it can feed everybody, right?
yeah,
Then the question is, are there any indications for that? Because I know like there are some small experiments on like agroforest and there's a lots of hydroponics. I know like I was in Singapore recently and they're like building huge hydroponic stuff, like, and what are the solutions? Like, okay, we want to get out there, we are recognized, let's assume you all recognize this is not the ideal for us. Okay, we can live on it, but we want to get out of this. So we how would we do it? And are there any other feasible alternatives for that?
yeah. That's a big question. Um, I think we're at an inflection point where there are calls for change, and one very important movement has been the Via Campesina peasant uprisings in response to the dialogue of food security. So this, to me, is really important because it shows that people are ready for change, and a critical part of the change is to question the organization of food and food policies that control how people produce food now, and also to question how we eat food, and if that's actually um, something we should take for granted, because I think a lot of us are eating foods that are not necessarily nutritious or balanced. We have rising obesity rates all over the world and all of the health problems from this. So I feel like um, it's not as simple as fixing the food supply chain, but it takes behavior change across many different levels. I think there's a lot of different technology approaches. Yes, and some of these are exciting. I think it will take a whole mix of things to create a more resilient system. I think a diversity in the approaches is really key of not depending on the major staples anymore, and instead producing a lot more food around us. Um, Trying to bring back indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge around older plant varieties and farming methods. I think we'll have to put a lot more labor into food production again. That's my feeling.
Hmm.
But this diverges from a lot of people who see technology as the key to transforming the food system. Um,
Man, I mean,
but to
if we
me,
talk about more labor, could robots, for example, take over this labor and still,
yeah, there's work being done on this for sure, especially as an alternative to pesticides and
yeah.
herbicides that they could manage these kinds of problems for us. Maybe. But I think the essence of the problem is that we've come so far from understanding our context. And in order to be back into a relationship that recognizes our natural boundaries, it's critical to try to get closer to the to understanding what we are, and also to recognize the importance of beings that are more than human. So that's, I think, my feeling about it is that
So,
technology keeps taking us further away from this idea
mhm,
that we are the
understood.
beings of the earth and that we
So I
depend
think there's
on.
this connection between us and the technology just increases this connection because it's an abstraction layer between us relating to this other living force that made us possible somehow. And
Yeah.
without the understanding of the connection, you will be like far abstracted and therefore less likely to take the right decisions. Something like that.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it's not about right or wrong. It's about being able to be in relationship with what we are, with the
Yeah,
essence of what we are. And
yeah,
yeah.
that's a good point. And okay, we talked a lot about this food topic and the industry and so on. What about like what does it have to do with geopolitics and like how does it have like how does it change the relationship between the countries, between the world, and what what these revolutions have done in relationship of how continents, countries. What is your view on this?
Well, food is it's the prime thing that people need, right? Food and water, and
And Wi-Fi.
yeah. um, so geopolitics has gone through a lot of changes as well, which I've learned about recently. And there's a lot more critical dialogue about what creates politics. Like, at what scales do politics happen? What creates a political body? And this has come a lot. There's a lot of discussion around feminist geopolitics and reconsidering the the interpersonal relationships that create much larger dynamics. Um, I think that the obvious things, of course, are just the control of resources, as always with geopolitics.
So,
Um,
so, for example, let's say in this geopolitical scenario, like the fact that we had this food revolution, who has profited most from those? Like, did that change the relationship from from the from the economies that already reached to economies that maybe were the main producers of food? What relationships were created in this process that we can, you see what I mean?
yeah, I think if you look at colonialism, it's very easy to see the extractive goals that countries had of first of all, they wanted to industrialize, and they had growing populations, and so it was super easy to take over new lands and get food for their people. So this has created um, a lot of displacement again, dispossession of land. So if you think about coffee in El Salvador, for instance, El Salvador was there's a great book called Coffee Lands, which I read recently, and I forget who the author is right now, but that it describes step by step the process of the growth of coffee production in El Salvador, and it in essence it was a wealthy, well functioning country. There was a lot of small farms. They produced a lot of food, and then people from England started coming and noticing the opportunity to grow more coffee there. So they started to consolidate land, take it away from people. And once people were kicked off of land, they didn't have means to produce their own food. And so they had to work in order to get money in order to buy food. And this, I never really thought about the tragedy of this, that because people were told that being a peasant was backwards, they became slaves to a capitalist system.
Yeah. Yeah, this
Yeah,
is a lot. I mean, I mean, coming from Brazil and looking a bit like how the way of like indigenous people are looking at the world, which was like more between dreaming and awake and work and art, everything was kind of mixed. They had a very different relationship. They had not this relationship with economy that we have in the our current understanding of the world. I guess a lot of those things were broken. I mean, there were like
yeah,
lots of different systems in the world, and then like I guess like the colonization process led to like starting to like, okay, give them alcohol, get them addicted to this, so I need to work to buy this thing, and then blah, blah, you control their resources in so many ways.
yeah,
How how that led to some processes of, I think, in overall, so the process of it's like more like m- m- monoculturalization, right? It's like not even saying like this is incorrect or not, but it was it's, this system was very effective at being at self propagating, right? Because
yeah,
it draw people in and then enslave them to continue being. So it grew itself in this type of economical relationships, and
yeah.
yeah, it's like a
And
meme. It's like a virus
yeah,
somehow.
exactly. So
Yeah.
we still have the after effects of this, which is that people were expelled from the land. They lost their traditional agricultural practices. They lost their traditional food sources. Now they depend on really cheap rice and wheat from the stores in the cities. So to get back to that, is really difficult, and that's why it's especially brutal to have to see the wealth in places like Europe where people have more than what they need, that there's so much wasted food, and people are being paid to plant fields of wildflowers. They don't have to produce their own food here anymore because of this history and this background, and there's still all of this debate around um, paying countries to deal with climate change. Uh, and they're in such a weak position now because they ended up producing commodities that and giving up the resilience of all the small farms that used to be in these places. And then of
Yeah,
course there's the whole meat thing with the majority of a big majority of crops going to be just food for animals, which is super inefficient, and
yeah,
biofuels.
yeah. No, in Brazil we are a fan of those.
Yeah.
We produce a lots of this stuff. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lots of soya for mainly a lot for feeding all the pigs that are eaten in Asia, mostly in China,
Mm.
and also America and so on. But yeah, and then we also have a lot of cows. We love them.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't necessarily, but it's something that really propagated a lot in Brazil, which leads a lot to deforestation of the forests
Yeah.
and so on. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So I think we're all really complicit in these big global changes. So it's really unfortunate that countries are just trying to be protectionist when it really takes a lot more global collaboration to address the changes that we're seeing.
yeah. So we touched upon the food system, the geopolitics, and now finally I would like to understand what does it have to do with ecology? Like, how do these food systems influence? Because you just touched upon this idea of like climate change and climate justice or whatever with the reparations or and the positioning. So I would love to understand how does then relate to the idea of ecology and like looking at our planet and saying, okay, all those food systems they are changed, now they're industrial, like the they change the soil, right? As we really concluded. So how did that affect the climate change, or does it affect it at all? Does that question make sense?
Well, I think the food supply chain is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases. If we can change the food system, we can make a huge step in reducing our emissions. And this is why it's my focus, because it's the real opportunity for change. It's not so much about the cars we drive or anything like this. It's a lot around the food that we eat and the food that we produce and the food that we ship around the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so, Jen, we are running to the end of our interview, and I wanted to just see if there's anything you want to share, like, because I know you've been studying more specific things, and maybe I missed to ask some questions. Are there any relevant insights that you think are relevant to share with everybody? And
Um, I'm trying to think if there's anything off the top of my head. I'm happy with what I shared. I think I would encourage everybody to um, think more about food, and I think it's super interesting, and um, Yeah, I think that it's like one of these small scale things because everything we eat becomes part of our body, and it's the way that we are related to the environment around us, and it's a beautiful thing to constantly be a transforming entity, transformed by the things that we eat and the things that we do, and um, I think that reconsidering our own idea of what food is and how it connects us with other people is the core thing.
Yeah, that's super inspiring. I wanted to also ask you, I mean, I know you probably have a lots of literature to share, like things that people can read. So maybe if you send me a list of this, I'll link this down below on the video and on the description so
Sure,
people can
yeah,
like dig into places they can learn more and investigate. And I think that might be interesting to share those resources with them.
for sure. Yeah, I've been reading a lot of great books lately, and I'd love to share.
Amazing. And then I guess we just continue the conversation because I guess you'll be learning and transforming and updating your thinking there. And it would be nice to just keep getting this update and see where that leads us and you in this process. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be nice. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thanks so much. And I see you next time.